I remember the day as if it were carved into my skin. I was 16, barely tall enough to reach the kitchen counter, standing there with a mix of fear and disbelief as my dad's face turned red, veins pulsing at his temples. I didn't even understand what had set him off at first. Just a secret I had accidentally stumbled into. Something I thought was harmless. Something I never imagined could explode into the fury that was now roaring at me. One second, we were talking, or at least I thought we were, and the next, words were flying like daggers. I tried to explain, to stammer, to show I didn't mean harm, but my voice was small against the storm. His shouting made my chest tighten, my stomach churn, and in that moment, the world I had known, the house, my room, my sense of safety, shattered. I felt tiny, invisible, and completely powerless. And then came the words that would haunt me for years. Get out, now. I never want to see you again. My heart stopped. My hand shook as I grabbed a backpack, stuffing in random belongings, not even thinking about what I was taking or leaving behind. I wanted to plead, to cry, to tell him it wasn't fair, but the weight of his fury pinned me in place. As I closed the door behind me, I realized I had no home, no anchor, nothing but the cold night, and a terrifying freedom I wasn't ready for. The echo of his yelling followed me down the street, the secret still burning between us, unspoken yet destructive. That night, under a street lamp, I understood the raw sting of rejection, the sharp edge of being underestimated, and the hollow ache of being powerless in the one place I should have felt safe. And yet in that moment of despair, a tiny, stubborn ember of resolve flickered in me. A quiet thought that maybe, someday, I wouldn't be this powerless again. For weeks after that night, I drifted through life like a ghost. I crashed on friends' couches, sometimes on floors, always trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible, careful not to burden anyone with my presence. Each morning, I woke up stiff and hungry, my stomach knotted with the memory of my dad's anger and the door slamming behind me. The world I had taken for granted, the warmth of my own bed, the familiarity of family routines, had vanished, leaving only the cold reality of abandonment. I worked every odd job I could find, sweeping floors, washing dishes, delivering newspapers, anything to scrape together enough for a meal or a bus ticket. Every interaction reminded me of my invisibility, the way customers barely noticed me, the way coworkers assumed I was incompetent because I didn't have polished shoes or a confident stride. At night, when I finally allowed myself to think, my mind wandered back to the house I'd been expelled from. I remembered my sister's room, painted perfectly pink, her shelves lined with trophies and awards my parents celebrated with loud pride. I remembered the way my dad always smiled at her successes, the quiet dismissals he gave me when I tried to share mine. The contrast between their favor and my rejection burned deeper than hunger or exhaustion. I could see clearly now what it meant to be unwanted, how it felt to be the child no one saw or believed in, the one who had been written out of the family narrative. And yet, even in the harshness of this new world, a flicker of determination grew inside me. I hated being invisible, hated the sting of favoritism that I had endured without understanding, and I began to dream quietly of a day when the scales would shift, when the powerless child would no longer be ignored, unseen, or undervalued. The years that followed were a strange mixture of survival and self-discovery. I spent my teenage and early adult years learning to navigate a world that hadn't prepared me, picking up skills wherever I could, cooking, budgeting, negotiating jobs, and managing every small victory as if it were a treasure. Each paycheck, no matter how tiny, felt like proof that I could exist on my own terms. Nights were long and lonely, but I filled them with books, online tutorials, and endless reflection. I replayed every word my dad had shouted, every dismissive glance my family had given me, and I let it fuel a quiet anger, a determination that I would never feel powerless again. There were moments of small pride, finishing a course, earning a promotion, or finally paying my own rent without asking for help. Each success was a tiny step toward reclaiming the dignity I had lost. Internally, I imagined a future where I could stand taller than those who had rejected me, where my accomplishments would speak louder than their cruelty. Even in the bleakest moments, hope whispered to me, "You will rise, and they will not see it coming." Those years forged me in silence, teaching me patience, self-reliance, and a deep understanding of the value of power, not the kind bought overnight, but the kind earned through persistence, resilience, and unwavering resolve. I began to realize that the life I had lost could one day be rebuilt, stronger and sharper than ever, and that the person I would become would command respect without needing to plead for it. Even as I carved out my life, the shadow of my family never fully left me. I learned through whispered rumors and accidental encounters that they were still talking about me, mocking me, twisting my choices, assuming I had failed spectacularly. Friends who still had contact with my relatives would pass along snippets, how my dad bragged about my disappearance, how my sister joked about the kid who couldn't make it, how relatives assumed I was struggling and lonely. Each word hit like a punch, a reminder that I was invisible to them in life but a source of amusement in their minds. I felt a mix of anger and incredulity, the sting of betrayal sharpened by the public nature of it. They had discarded me, yet I was still on display for ridicule. The contrast was unbearable. They lived comfortably, secure in their wealth and status, while I had clawed my way through nights of fear and hunger, unnoticed and underestimated. But beneath the outrage, a new fire burned. The humiliation they so casually spread became fuel for my determination. I refused to allow their assumptions to define me, to let their laughter dictate the trajectory of my life. In secret, I promised myself that one day the story would flip, that I would walk into a room they had once mocked me for not belonging to, and everything would change. Their careless words had given me something they could never take away, the relentless drive to rise higher than they ever imagined. I had almost stopped expecting life to hand me anything but struggle. But then it happened. The first glimpse of a door opening, small and almost imperceptible, yet heavy with possibility. It started innocently enough. A casual conversation with a colleague led to a recommendation for a side project that paid more than anything I'd ever earned. I threw myself into it, driven not just by need, but by a simmering desire to prove my worth, to build something that could never be mocked or dismissed. The work was grueling, often stretching my patience and stamina to the limit, but each completed task added layers of confidence I hadn't felt in years. Around the same time, I discovered hints of a forgotten inheritance through distant relatives, a legacy no one had expected me to claim, and it sparked a dangerous kind of hope. My heart would race at the thought, knowing that one day, if I played my cards right, I could stand in a position they had never imagined, a reversal of power that would be devastating yet just. The tension built quietly at first, like the hum of a storm on the horizon, each small success stacking upon the last. I imagined walking back into the lives that had once discarded me, no longer as the powerless child, but as someone who had outlasted, outsmarted, and quietly outshone them. The thrill of possibility mingled with fear. Fear of failure, fear of exposure, fear of yet another betrayal. But it was a necessary risk, one I couldn't ignore. This was the beginning of something greater, a slow, deliberate climb toward a life where I controlled the narrative and the power that had been denied to me for so long. Every day I felt the subtle shift in myself, the rising tension of a story that had been dormant for years, now beginning to unfold. By my mid-20s, the life I had clawed together began to take shape. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building, investing, and quietly expanding my skills and resources. Every promotion, every contract, every deal felt like a silent victory, a private proof that I was no longer the powerless teenager my family had discarded. I bought a small apartment, furnished it modestly but comfortably, and created routines that anchored me in stability. Socially, I stayed cautious, keeping my distance from anyone who might report back to them or reopen old wounds. I wanted no reminders of the family who had cast me aside, no interference in the life I was meticulously constructing. The contrast was stark. The boy who had been rejected and mocked now held a life of independence, wealth, and control, yet remained invisible to those who had assumed I'd fail. I watched their social updates from afar, occasionally noting their wealth or status, and felt a quiet surge of vindication. I didn't boast, I didn't flaunt, I let my absence speak, This invisibility became my shield and my strategy, a way to prepare for the moment when the tables would turn. Deep inside, I knew that one day, the strength I had quietly amassed would no longer be hidden. I would step into their world, but not as the child they had rejected. I would enter it on my terms, armed with the power and confidence they had never anticipated. Every late night spent reviewing investments, every sleepless hour negotiating contracts, every small success was laying the foundation for a reckoning they couldn't see coming, a reversal of fortune that would finally force them to confront the consequences of their cruelty. Years later, I finally discovered the truth about why my dad had thrown me out that night. The secret I had thought was trivial, the one I had stumbled upon by accident, was far more complicated and far less damning than I had ever imagined. It wasn't about betrayal, rebellion, or disobedience in the way I had feared. Instead, it was a misunderstanding blown completely out of proportion, tangled with his own insecurities and pride. Knowing this, a rush of emotions hit me at once. Anger at the unfairness, sorrow for the wasted years, and confusion over why a single misstep could cost me everything I had ever known. I replayed the argument in my mind, recalling every word, every look, every accusation. And suddenly, the absurdity of it all was glaring. And yet, beneath the bitterness, I felt empathy creeping in. For him, for the family who had acted out of fear, ignorance, and vanity. Still, understanding the truth didn't erase the pain or the years of struggle I had endured alone. It only made the betrayal sharper in some ways, because it was clear how preventable it had been. I felt a strange mix of grief and vindication, a complicated brew of emotions that left me unsettled but oddly resolute. This revelation ignited a new internal tension. I now had the full picture, and with it, a choice. How would I respond when the family finally crossed my path again? The answer simmered quietly within me, growing stronger with each passing thought. I was sitting in my study, reviewing the latest reports for a project I had poured months into, when a sharp knock at the door shattered the quiet. My heart froze, a cold dread creeping into my chest because I knew, before even peeking through the peephole, who it was. 15 years had passed since they had thrown me out. 15 years of silence, struggle, and careful planning, and now they were standing on my doorstep, looking smaller, uncertain, and desperate. My mind raced as I debated whether to open it. Part of me wanted to retreat, to hide behind the life I had built and deny them the satisfaction of seeing me again. But another part of me, the part that had nursed anger, ambition, and the quiet hope of revenge, urged me to face them. I could hear faint voices through the door, pleading, hesitating, their tones tinged with guilt and need. The suspense was unbearable. I could almost see the scene playing out inside my head. Their expressions when they realized how much I had changed, how far I had come without them. My hand hovered over the doorknob, frozen by the weight of the moment, the potential for confrontation, the possibility of reclaiming power in a way they could never anticipate. One small twist of my wrist, and everything could change. But I hesitated, savoring the tension, letting the suspense stretch thin, because this was the moment I had imagined for years. The question loomed like a shadow over my carefully constructed life. Would I open the door and face them, or let them remain outside, powerless and desperate? As I stood there, my hand still poised on the doorknob, it hit me with full force. I was no longer the scared, powerless child they had thrown out all those years ago. 15 years of struggle, learning, and quiet victories had transformed me into someone they could no longer intimidate. Their hesitation outside the door, the subtle tremor in their voices, the way they glanced at one another with uncertainty, it all screamed vulnerability. For the first time, I had the upper hand, and I could feel the thrill of control surging through me. Every instinct told me to savor this, to let them linger in their fear just a moment longer, while I formulated exactly how I would respond. In my mind, I ran through scenarios. A calm but cutting refusal, a reminder of every slight and humiliation they had caused, or a subtle display of the wealth and power I had quietly amassed. Each option carried its own weight, its own potential for impact. The contrast between us was stark. They, desperate, unsure, seeking forgiveness or validation. Me, composed, measured, in complete command of the situation. My pulse quickened, But not with fear. This was satisfaction, anticipation, the quiet ecstasy of finally having the chance to rewrite the narrative. I rehearsed my words silently, imagining the exact tone, the pauses, the glances that would make them feel the shift in power. I could almost see the disbelief settling on their faces, the shock that I was no longer the child they had dismissed. For the first time in my life, I realized the truth of what I had always imagined. I was in control, and the next move was mine to make. The first reversal of power was about to unfold, and every nerve in my body thrummed with the anticipation of justice, quiet but absolute. I opened the door before they could gather courage, and time folded in on itself. The faces that looked back at me were smaller than memory. My father's jaw slack with a fatigue I had never seen before. My mother's mouth a tight line. My sister's eyes darting like a child caught in mischief. They shuffled in like refugees, awkward with their shoes on my welcome mat, hands wringing, voices thin with apology and excuse. "We didn't know where else to go," my mother began, and the words felt ridiculous against the reality of everything they'd done. They expected pleading, perhaps a breakdown, perhaps the same frightened boy they had exiled. Instead, I smiled a quiet, measured smile and invited them to sit. I made coffee, poured it deliberately, listened as they stumbled through rehearsed confessions. I let them talk until the silence settled heavy. Then I placed a folder on the coffee table and slid it across. They blinked. My sister reached for it with a greedy curiosity that made my skin prickle. "What's this?" she asked. I had rehearsed my voice for years, the tone that would cut without yelling, that would assert without pleading. "Paperwork," I said simply. "Official paperwork." My father's face read impatience, then a faint flush of fear. I watched them shrink into smallness. How satisfying to see arrogance falter. I told them about the years they had spent presuming my failure, about the jokes at my expense, the casual cruelty that had meant nothing to them but everything to me. I gave examples, precise and cold. The graduation they ignored, the birthday they celebrated for my sister while pretending I didn't exist. Then I opened the folder and laid out the evidence of the life I'd built. Bank statements, contracts, quiet victories printed and bound. I spoke through investments, the company I'd helped grow, the property I'd purchased. Comprehension dawned, then panic. My father's face went paper thin when I mentioned the deed with his old house's address on it. He stammered denials that shrank under my calm. They had come hoping for pity. Instead, they found leverage turned against them. I could have called security, filed charges, demanded restitution. Instead, I offered them a contract. "I can help," I said, "but not the way you imagine." Their eyes widened. My voice held firm. "You will apologize on record. You will acknowledge my name, my history, the harm you did. You will sign a public statement renouncing the stories you told about me, and you will agree to work temporarily under my supervision, small, accountable tasks until you've demonstrated humility and effort." My sister's face crumpled with the realization of what I was asking. Humiliation served with legal precision. The word work made them shiver. They had never imagined a life without status had such demands. "You can't expect," my father began, but I cut him off. "I expect truth. I expect accountability." I watched them barter for less, offer hollow apologies that tasted false. I measured each concession, letting them see the price of their arrogance. When my mother finally signed, pen trembling, there was no drama, only the hollow sound of ink and the world tipping toward justice. I offered them shelter. Not charity, but probation with terms. They could sleep in a guest room, but only after fulfilling obligations. The reversal was surgical and public enough to sting. I had not yelled. I had orchestrated conditions where their dignity unraveled under the weight of their own admissions. As they left the room to speak privately, clutching the papers, I caught my reflection in the window. The man in the glass was not the child who had run into the night 15 years ago. He was composed, deliberately merciless in a way that felt like justice rather than cruelty. The satisfaction settled into something quieter than triumph, a clean relief that accountability, however small, had been acknowledged. I closed the door behind them and heard the hush of the hallway like a held breath. They had come begging. They left bargaining for dignity I didn't owe. The first blow had landed, calculated, cutting, and irrevocable, and I knew their shock would ripple outward. I had given them a taste of their own medicine, measured and merciful in its denial of spectacle. I imagined my father's name shrinking in the neighborhood gossip, their friends murmuring, the invitations drying up. I pictured social feeds alight with disbelief, cousins whispering, and their carefully curated image beginning to fray in ways no amount of money could stitch back together, and pride curdling into shame. I sat down, the folder still warm in my hands, feeling the quiet before whatever came next, their reaction, their collapse, the way this would echo through our small town and the people who had once cheered them on. I watched them retreat to the living room, papers clutched in trembling hands, faces pale and drawn. My father's jaw twitched, the anger that had once fueled him now replaced by disbelief and shame. My mother sank into the couch, shoulders slumping, the carefully maintained composure of a lifetime dissolving in seconds. My sister stared at the folder as if it were radioactive, her eyes wide with panic, the smugness she had once carried evaporating entirely. Every word I had spoken, every fact I had laid bare, pressed on them like a weight they hadn't known existed. The shock in their eyes was palpable. The realization that I had thrived while they had underestimated me, that I had quietly built power and independence, and that their cruelty had yielded nothing but embarrassment for them. There were murmurs of apology, stammered confessions, attempts to explain away years of dismissal and mockery, but each word only emphasized the depth of their previous wrongdoing. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and empathy as I observed them unravel. They were human, flawed, and now forced to confront the consequences of their actions. Their astonishment, the way they shifted uneasily under my gaze, fed a cathartic release I hadn't anticipated. It was not gloating, but the quiet justice of truth finally being recognized. The room was thick with tension and unspoken regret, a mirror of the years I had endured. But now the power dynamic had reversed completely. I could feel the balance tilting. For the first time they were vulnerable, and I was steady, unshaken. Watching them grapple with the reality of my growth, my achievements, and my deliberate composure brought a sense of closure that was long overdue, a satisfying convergence of empathy and justice that resonated deep within me. After the whirlwind of confrontation and carefully measured payback, I sat alone in the quiet of my home, letting the adrenaline ebb and my thoughts settle. I reflected on the years of struggle, the nights I had spent hungry, the jobs that seemed endless, the relentless grind to prove to myself that I mattered. Revenge had been sweeter than I imagined, but it was also bittersweet. It wasn't the cruelty I had relished, but the reclaiming of my dignity, the acknowledgement of my worth, and the stark contrast between who I had been and who I had become. I realized that every hardship, every moment of invisibility, had forged a resilience and self-reliance I could never have learned otherwise. The family I had once longed for was now a reflection of lessons in patience, strategy, and moral clarity. I felt gratitude for my own growth, even as I recognized the lingering sadness for what could have been. A childhood not marred by rejection, love that had been withheld. The satisfaction wasn't in punishment alone, but in the knowledge that I had lived fully, triumphed quietly, and emerged stronger. As I looked around my home, the life I had built stood as testament to endurance and self-respect. Revenge had come with a price, but so had wisdom, empowerment, and the deep, enduring sense of closure that finally allowed me to let go of the past without regret. Just as I thought the chapter was closed, a knock came at my door again, this time unexpected, hesitant, and unfamiliar. A lawyer I had once helped years ago stepped in, carrying documents I hadn't anticipated, revealing a hidden clause in my inheritance that had remained dormant all this time. The clause ensured that any attempt by my family to interfere with certain assets would automatically redirect them entirely to me. The irony was delicious. Every move they had made, every effort to regain favor, had inadvertently strengthened my position further. My family, already humiliated, would remain powerless even if they tried to rebuild bridges. The lawyer explained the details with clinical precision, and I listened, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across my face. The layers of karma were stacking neatly, as if the universe itself had conspired to amplify justice. I realized that sometimes the most devastating victories weren't loud or public. They were subtle, irreversible, and utterly unexpected. This twist, hidden for years, would ensure that the lessons of their arrogance and cruelty echoed far beyond my doorstep. I leaned back, letting the knowledge settle, knowing that the world had been rearranged in ways they could never predict, and for the first time in decades, the past felt not just avenged, but perfectly balanced. As the dust settled from the confrontation, I finally allowed myself to reflect on everything: the pain, the struggle, the triumphs, and the subtle victories that had defined my journey. I realized that true strength isn't loud or explosive. It's quiet, consistent, and rooted in resilience. Self-worth cannot be granted by others. It must be earned, protected, and recognized internally before anyone else can ever acknowledge it. Life had tested me in ways I never asked for, but it had also taught me patience, strategy, and the importance of moral clarity.